slightly triggering thumbnail there. When is 5 Newton meters not 5 Newton meters? We see it all over our bikes, 5 Newton meters here, 10 there, etc. But this video is inspired by the comment section from the last couple of videos when we were talking about greases and thread lockers and how you might need to adjust your torque settings to compensate for things. So taking all that on board, and we're going to go through all of that. We're basically going to leave you hopefully with everything you need to know about making the right decisions, because as with anything in cycling and mechanics, there's not an absolute clear black and white answer, I'm afraid. But if you understand what it is that you're trying to achieve, what risks you are trying to mitigate, I think you'll leave this video feeling pretty confident about the decisions you're making in your home workshop. Okay, with that in mind, what are the actual risks? You know, what is the anxiety here? One, the easy one is your bolt's too loose. Things are going to rattle loose, things are going to come loose, and you'll end up in a pile bar side of the road in a whole load of pain. That's dead easy. But what if we over tighten our bolts? That's probably the one that we don't really fully comprehend. Now, there are 4 risks involved with this. Now, the first one, again, you'll all know, if you are trying to clamp something, you've got your expensive carbon handlebar, seat post, whatever, and you over tighten that bolt and you go, and you hear that carbon crush. Probably every single workshop in the world has come across a handlebar with these big 2 dents into the handlebar, and heard that crack go. Now, the second one is your threads. So the actual threads of the bolts or the threads inside the component can just strip. We over tighten them and they just collapse. Especially true if you've got like a hardened steel bolt inside an aluminium component, especially a really lightweight aluminium component, and it just strips the threads out. In theory, you can repair it with a helicoil. It's not the most ideal situation. Now, the next thing we can do is just round off the head of the bolt. We go and put our tool in there, and that nice hex or that torque shape just rounds off, and we just cannot get our tool to tighten or loosen anything. The bolt is just stuck in the component. And then the last one we don't really think about that much is the actual yield strength. So as you tighten those bolts stretch, especially lightweight aluminium and titanium. They'll stretch a little bit, and then we undo them, they'll contract and stretch and contract, and eventually they can just break. So those are the 4 risks that we're worried about. But how on earth do we try and mitigate them? The little bit of physics and mathematics behind this is a really simple equation. Torque in this situation is friction, what we call the K factor, or K in this equation, times the dimension times force. Now, the great news is the dimension stays the same. So an M5 bolt is an M5 bolt, that stays the same, that's our constant. Now, the torque essentially stays the same because we're going to take our torque settings from here or not, but the force will change. So if the friction of the bolt changes and we don't adjust our torque, that has to go somewhere, and the force will increase to give us the same torque. Remember, torque equals K times D times F. Now, I'm sure we could all imagine that a dry bolt has a relatively high K factor, and a lubricated bolt will have a lower K factor. In fact, I've got something off the internet here, some common K factors of screws. So for instance, dry screws unlubricated, 0.2, stainless steel screws are a little bit slipperier, aluminium screws about the same as stainless steel, and then if you lubricate them, it's about half. So if you put a grease or a Loctite, because this can actually be lubricating. I think the big fear and anxiety here is when you see this written on your bike, does it assume that it's got some Threadlocker applied, or some grease, or a completely naked thread? You know, should you adjust your torque settings to compensate or not? Well, here's the thing, like contrary to what you'll read a lot online, is always assume factory settings. So when you've got something like this and it says 5 Newton meters, assume that it is box fresh as intended. Now, Shimano, SRAM, Campagnolo are fantastic at all of this, and so are quite a lot of the component brands, but there are discrepancies. So Shimano, for instance, when you go through their installation manual, they are specific when you want to add grease. So for instance, here it is installing an Octolink bottom bracket, and you'll see grease, and it'll also say if you've got a plastic end to your square taper, don't add grease. You know, even though it's got a thread lock, it's specifically asking you for grease. Same with their bottom brackets, even though that there is pre-applied thread lock on there, it will ask you for grease. However, that is not the case for every single bolt situation. So a lot of Shimano bolts now will come with a patch, this little patch here, white on Shimano, blue, and SRAM will do the same. Here's some B-roll just to show you what a fresh patch looks like. And those bolts will not ask for any grease at all because they've already been pre-patched. And SRAM is the same, it will say add grease here, and so will Campagnolo. In fact, the Campagnolo instructions are really specific. What none of them do is say, do not apply grease. They just assume that you're going to use the bolt as it came out of the box in factory settings, if you like. Now, that's great, factory settings. You know, we've got this bolt with a little blue patch on it, we install it, as it says in the instructions, to the torque settings. But, you know, you're a home mechanic, you like to take your bike apart, maybe you've done some bike fitting, you've undone this bolt a few times, done it up, adjusted your handlebars, maybe you've undone your stem, put it in a bike box, you've adjusted your saddle, and that little blue patch has now started to wear off. You know, here are some bolts here which have been on and off a couple of times, and that blue patch is starting to wear. Or maybe your bike's a little bit older, it's been on and off a few times, sometimes you've added some thread lock, sometimes you've added some grease, and you've got a bolt that's just a mess. You know, what should you do in those situations? Should you add another grease or another thread locker, and how should you adjust your torque settings? Or what if you want to upgrade something? You want to switch to a titanium bolt or something. And when you buy titanium bolts from somewhere like Thai Bike, they don't come with any patch on them at all. They're just a naked bolt. Before I go on to the solution, there's a few things to watch out for. One is that some manufacturers are shitbags. So here's an instance. So FSA, for instance, they, in their instructions, big red circles, say apply grease to these bolts. But if you take the bolt out, you will see that they have already put some thread lock on there. So do you put grease on top of the thread lock? Well, this is where I suspect that the engineer who designed this and then wrote the instructions probably then didn't speak to the factory, or the factory just assumed that they wanted a thread lock bolt and fitted one anyway. The problem is that if you use the patch and you use the grease, neither of those two things work properly. The thread lock won't set and do its job because it's covered in grease, and the grease won't work because it's all mixed in with some thread lock. So ideally you want one or the other, so you're going to have to either wipe one off or replace it, or replace like for like. Now the good news is that if you've got a bolt that is half and half, like you've had a patch on there but it's a bit worn off, great. I would probably just replace that with some Loctite 243. Now this has a problem which I'll come on to in a second. For home mechanics, I'd probably say go for a Loctite 248, which is basically a thread locker in like a glue stick form. Now the reason you might want to do that is something to do called hydraulic lock, and that is when you have certain parts of your bike where there is a blind hole. So that means that any excess liquid can't drip out. So on the bottom of this component, if I put too much thread locker in, it will just come out the other end, no big deal. On the top here, it will stay in there. Now, this is really common on brake calipers, which are also a blind hole. Lots of other instances, the one that's given us a bit of concern at the moment is on the new aero bikes, when they've blanked off the through axle side. So you've now got a blind hole. If you put too much grease on the through axle, you can just hydraulic lock. So when you're doing your torque settings up, you'll get a hydraulic lock as opposed to a proper torque reading off it. So just watch out for that. Now, what if you want to use an assembly grease? Now, we talked about this in the previous videos. This is a calcium sulfonate grease. In fact, a few of you said you were struggling to get hold of this. Peerless OG2 is pretty much the same thing if you can get hold of that in your country. So you might want to do this because you might be sick of all your bolts going rusty and getting seized, and you might want to apply some anti-seize to it. Totally get that, in which case you're going to have to take off all the thread locker, replace it with some lube, and understand what you might be creating here. One, you might need to reduce your torque settings because you've now got a slipperier bolt, i.e. you've reduced the K. And the other thing is that you think, is that got a risk of vibrating out because it's not going to do a thread locking job, it's going to be an anti-seize. Now, this isn't a grease, i.e. it's not a lubricant, it should stay tight and be tight as opposed to like a bearing lube, for instance, which might be slippery enough for a bolt to back itself out. But you're going to need to clean it with more than just IPA. You're going to need to use a proper contact cleaner and really get in there and clean that bolt if you're going to do that. So where are we up to? 1, factory settings, dead easy. Follow the instructions. If it says put grease on it, put grease on it. If it doesn't say put grease on it, don't do it. That is the thing. Now, if you are servicing your bike and you want to replace it, I would personally just replace Threadlocker with Threadlocker, like I said, and use the exact same torque settings, because even though this is wet, it's a wax as opposed to a lubricant. So for all intents and purposes, your torque settings aren't going to change hardly at all, not even noticeable. However, if you decide that you want to use a lubricant, so that might be because you're going to fit some fancy titanium bolts, or you just want to have something weather protected and stop the corrosion, then you are going to need to adjust your torque settings down. So clean off all that old thread locker, apply your anti-seize, and then think about reducing your torque settings. Now, as a general rule, you can reduce your torque settings by between 20 and 30%. So what I tend to do is go for 25 because the maths are a little bit easier to work out. The important thing is that you try and treat your torque specifications as guidelines rather than absolute targets based on that equation information I've given you so far. So for instance, what you might see written here, you might see a very specific torque setting, 5.2 for instance. That's probably come from a conversion from Imperial if you see something that precise. So if it just says a number, 5 Newton meters, then you need to make sure that you hit 5 Newton meters from the factory setting. So factory settings was with a patch, that's 5 Newton meters with a factory fresh patch. Now, if you then want to put some anti-seize on there instead, reduce your torque settings by the 25% and then test function. So what we're trying to do is make sure that we've got the smallest amount of torque possible that the component will still function and be safe. So reduce it by 25% and then test it. That's the important thing. Get onto the bars, properly push on them, get the bars in between your legs and wrestle it. Can you move your saddle, etc.? If the component fails, then put it back in its place, add another 0.5 Newton meters, test it again, add 0.5 Newton meter, test it again. When the component holds doing its job, at less torque than what is written on there, you're probably okay. The problem comes is if you exceed that torque value. Now, sometimes you'll see like here, it says 5 Newton meters max. Therefore, that max is not a target. You're going for the least amount of torque possible for the component to function. If you end up exceeding that 5 Newton meters with factory settings, then you have a problem somewhere. Something is out of spec, something's not right. Go and get it checked out. Now, if you've applied a different type of lubricant and you're exceeding that, then you've definitely got a problem. Okay, so where are we up to? 1, we know the risks that we're trying to mitigate. 2, we know what torque actually is, and when we change the friction of the bolt, we need to factor down our torque reading to make sure we don't exceed the force. We know where to go and find manufacturer's specifications and specifically look for whether it asks for grease, and if it doesn't, it means it's going to be in the factory condition. We know what to do if our bolt is not in factory condition or we decided to modify it. So the next thing is, what tools do we actually use? Well, again, I said in the previous video, I've never really found a torque wrench that I absolutely love and would love to recommend. We use quite a lot of different stuff here. So I talked in a previous video about liking these Effetto Mariposa. So for me, when you're doing little bolts like this, I want them to be small. I want to be able to get around the bike, you know, and work quite efficiently And these are doing the job for me right now. I have given this to a customer and they really struggled to make it click. I don't know what they were doing, but like it just, I think they were holding it in a really strange way. Then we have like digital torque wrenches. This is mostly used in the suspension room. You can see we normally have like the little 2s and the little micro hexes on there because these are going to be decimals, like half a Newton meter, for instance, type stuff. You've got to be a whole lot more precise with suspension work. Some of the guys, like this is the bigger Wearer torque wrench. It's not my favourite. I find it quite big and cumbersome, and it's quite slow to adjust. Like it feels like you're constantly there winding it on. I don't like their safety torque ones. You've probably seen in a video, probably a couple of years ago now, when they did one where you couldn't exceed because it would just like clutch out. They were terrible, absolutely terrifying to use. And then for our big stuff, I do like the Wearers because they have a big reversible head and you can just take this off and turn it around. So if you're doing reverse threads on things like bottom brackets and Campagnolo Super Record, the 12-speed one, bolt, you can still undo things and do things up with that. And then, because those are half-inch head, we can get proper, tool steel bottom bracket tools on there, which I just think are brilliant when you've really got to crank on something. These are great. And of course, like these are the Wearer hex bits. Again, we've got this big like 10 mil, a whole load of these actually, which you can get in there with those really long crank bolts for pedals. One thing worth doing actually is a really dangerous bolt to do is the shifter bolt here. The shifter clamp bolt is really hard to get to, so I'd really recommend getting a really long, either T25 for Campagnolo. Most things are now 5 mil, and you can get really good purchase on that, and then you're not having to take your Allen key out. You can leave it engaged and then bring it up to torque. If you haven't got those, then you can get these in relatively long like hex bits like this. That all works. And yeah, the really, really important thing is when you're using these, remember that they're going to measure assuming the length of this lever. So you can't hold it here. You've got to use your torque wrench on the handle. That's where it's been designed. The length of the lever is really important. So when you're doing something up like this, also, you can't just use a static bolt. It's going to assume that you're going to be moving. So to get an accurate torque setting, you're going to need to back it off. And then as you tighten, you hold the end, and it's got to be while the bolt is moving, it clicks. That's the right way to do things. You can't go around and have a static bolt which is already at torque and get an accurate torque measurement from it. The bolt needs to be in motion and then it'll come over and click. And of course the other thing is, you've got torque wrenches, always dial off the torque, and be careful because some torque wrenches will go beyond its minimum setting. So Wearer, for instance, this one will say in the instructions dial it off to 2.5, but you can easily go beyond that. So just to watch out, a lot of torque wrenches will say dial it back to a setting as opposed to just wind everything off completely. Well done for making it this far in the video. Thing to remember, always, 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 if you're worried about it, remember, adjust your torque wrench below what it says and then test the component. Actually really put your body weight and lean into it. Get the front wheel between your legs and like properly wrestle the bike. Make sure that nothing moves. Are your shifters static? Does your saddle move? Is your wheel moving? Now, that is the important thing. Never, especially if you're a pro bike mechanic, what I've always taught my mechanics here is imagine that you're about to give this bike to someone and the first thing they're going to do is take it up to the Kirkstone Pass up the road and they're going to ride down here on it. How confident are you? That's like a little mental check in your mind. Would you get on that bike at the top of Kirkstone Pass? It sort of focuses you on a little bit just to make sure, check, 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 check. In fact, when it's really, really busy here, we've got a policy where our mechanics feel really open to say, I finished this, can someone please just test ride it and check it? It seems to work really well. Of course, every now and then something does happen, but most of the time with mechanics that are open enough to ask their colleagues for help, you mitigate most chances of anything going wrong. Check, check, check. Okay, Right, I'm done. Well done everybody for getting through that video. The DT Swiss wheel review, I was about to publish that and then I realised I never actually weighed them, which is a ridiculous thing to do because they're one of the lightest weight wheels that DT Swiss has ever done. So I'm going to go and re-edit that with Chris when he gets back from his holiday, and that video will be the next one after that, I promise. Again, if you like this, get into the comments, fire them up. I'll try and answer as many questions as I can. Other than that, yeah, cheers for watching. See you on the next one.